Tai labas rytas visiems iš tolimos Australijos, kur pas mus dabar 35 laipsniai ir vėjas pučia kaitra, o pas jūs kitkas.
Kad savaitgalį bus 42 jūra, ar atlaikysit?
Savaitgalį bus 42, atlaikysiu.
Puiku, puiku. Jūra, aš perdodu jums mikrofoną ir mūsų vertėja Jūratė yra pasiruošus versti jūsų angliškas skaidres, tai jūs
Puiku.
galit pereiti prie tos kalbos, kuri gal patogesnė, bet ačiū už lietuvišką žodį ir perdodu tada jums mikrofoną.
Ačiū. Well, good morning from the other side of the world, where we are roasting while you are freezing. To me, it is an honor to be able to see this project that ISADD has started, ISADD LT, ISADD Lithuania. It is such a valuable project, and to hear the results is heartwarming. They are valuable results, and we need more of this. But my job today is to look at what happened in Australia and the experience we've had over the last however many years I've been working. Too many. Next. So, following inclusion, and I'd like to discriminate first with definitions. Inclusion and integration, sometimes used interchangeably, but not very valuably. Inclusion is more. Integration is just providing the child with a roof over their head, sharing with the others, age peers, with possibly doing the same program with the same system of education, and unfortunately, not having much success in many cases. So you might find a little boy sitting in Lithuania, listening to a history lesson to the other children about Gediminas, and he's been given to draw Gediminas's castle. Well, it's good for drawing, but maybe not inclusive. He's not learning anything he needs. Inclusion means that he is included and accepted, but it also means that he has to be taught what he needs to be taught to be able to go out in the community. So teaching styles and teaching content has to be adapted to that child's needs, individualized. And there's respect for the individual, and he must be treated as an equal. Next. I'm not going to talk about the benefits. Whoops. I'm not going to talk about the benefits of inclusion. We're not there. It's the one with the arrows on it, yes. Because they don't need improving. They have been proven. But I will just remind you of one man, a 50-year-old gentleman, 50 plus, came to me asking for a diagnosis. And he was a very angry old man. He was angry at his kindergarten teacher all those years ago. He was saying, she told my mother that I should go to special school. And now look at me. I have no education. I have no job. I have no friends. I have nothing. She probably has got everything. He was very, very angry. Thank God he wasn't angry at his mother. Yes. Next. Let's have a look at the history in Australia and probably everywhere else Up to the 60s, there was no education for the uneducable, just institutions and only basic training for the trainable. Today we train dogs, not children. The less disabled just sat in the classroom with no program, no support, and obviously no learning. Old attitudes to disability needed to be changed. There was a fear of shamefulness and the belief that disability was irreversible and they could not do anything, when we know they can. They can't do everything, but they can do a lot. Even the late Queen of England had a few cousins hidden in institutions in the countryside because they were intellectually disabled. Next. So, changing attitudes in the 70s. Education departments, and before I start here, I'll tell you about the chaotic state of Australian education departments. We're a federation, so we have a federal education department for all Australian children, and they provide the money. But we also have 8 different education departments for the states. And we have 3 types of schools. We have the state school system, we have the private school system, and we have the Catholic school system. So can you imagine that when rules are made and how they are looked at and how they are shaped is generally a bit of a mess. Integration appears to be an ideal, and we all talked about it back then. The Carmel Report, 73, recommended it, but that didn't mean that it was put to work. It was only recommendations, but it sought diversity. In 1974, the federal government actually allocated funds to build special education, schools mainly. But until then, the funds were just something they scraped off the general. So now special kids get their own little basket of money. Next. The 80s and the 90s were a time of a lot of good, positive feeling. Pardon me. Institutions were being shut down all over the state. This was institutions for the disabled, institutions for the psychiatric, and they were supposed to go out in the community and be integrated in the community and be supported by the community. However, more and more special schools were being built. All children aged between 6 to 16 became the responsibility of education departments, and that brought a bit of a kerfuffle. All those kids in the institutions had never been to school, and nobody ever thought they should be to school. But suddenly, we had school for them. To put them into a special school, they needed some idea of where their ability was, what level they were, and what they should be learning. And they didn't have any psychologists in Victoria to do that because they all worked in the school systems, except for 2 of us working with sensorially impaired babies, babies with hearing loss, babies with visual loss. So we had to go through all these kids and give them some sort of assessment very quickly, 10 a day. It was an experience for me as a young psych, an experience indeed. And then these kids went out, and in some of the country towns where there were no special schools, they went into the ordinary school. And in one country town, we had a revolution from the teachers. They were having nervous breakdowns. They were not coping. They were stressed out of their minds. So we were sent up there to calm them down. What we found was that the teachers thought they had to give these children the same syllabus that the others were getting. These kids had never seen a book. They weren't going to start reading. These were institution kids. They were being fed and dressed and not much else. We had to calm the teachers down. When we looked at the classrooms, we praised them. These kids were doing what the other kids were doing. They were lining up to go into the room. They were sitting down when the others sat. They were standing up when the others stood up. These teachers were socializing these kids beautifully. They weren't teaching maths and grammar and reading. So we knew we had to change what we said to teachers. The 94 Salamanca Statement brings the ideals forward. Education for all, celebrate differences, respond. So enthusiasm was high, but practice was not that high. Next. Ideology is well ahead of practice. If you look, we're into the 20s now. States and territories passed acts adopting inclusive education policies, which included providing individual education plans, IEPs. In fact, they were asking teachers to teach children and not classes. The Gonski report of 2011 recommends a needs-based funding model, yet reform has just been very, very slow. Everybody still talks about Gonski, but very little is actually being done. 2013, we had a major change in Australia. The federal government, that's the whole of Australia, brought in the National Disability Insurance Scheme. It took a while to roll out, but it was a brilliant and huge involvement. It provided funding to support skill development, not academic skills, in order to increase community participation in all people who were disabled up to the age of 60. Then they went on the pension. As it rolled out, it supported individual education, because those children who were given support in what they needed for the community were also given support for individual education. They were learning to talk. They were learning to behave appropriately. They were learning functional skills. And they were turning the view of everybody to realizing the need for individual education, because NDIS is individual. Everybody sets their goals and then they work towards those goals. So you see, it was sort of that health disability group that began to influence. Next slide, please. And so we have a picture. What's the scene in 2013? I rather like that, because really nothing much seems to have changed. We still have special schools galore, but we have full inclusion available everywhere, in primary, secondary, and senior secondary. We have partial special classes available in some, and it's interesting to see that Victoria, which on the whole is more progressive, doesn't seem to have these because they actually include their kids in the total class system. And the same teachers are responsible. Tasmania, which is probably the poorest, doesn't. So they're not that flexible. So it hides a lot of the good things of this situation. Next. So looking at it, it's much less than we hoped for, but not too bad. We do have very large numbers of children with various disabilities in local schools. And it seems you do too. Sometimes up to 3 per classroom. The units that are attached to schools actually have been quite useful because many of them only work for the early grades, and their purpose is to bring the child up to the level where he can join his age group in the local school. There are special units for autism and there are special units for language. In my experience, the language units have done very, very well. And I've met many children who would have floundered in the second half of primary school without language, still coping because of those units. The autism units were so-so. Unfortunately, when someone has a language problem, we know how much of it he has. When someone has autism, we don't tend to use the quantity of it. And so the children with good potential for autism were put into units. And I had to fight for one little boy to get him out of the unit. And when we eventually got him integrated, he just took off. The mother, who took a lot of convincing because she said, but he is autistic, he needs something special, has been ringing and saying, thank you, the child has blossomed. So there is a need to be very careful when you've got units. Schools and special ed trained teachers support most classroom teachers. And I have a little story about support teachers. Long ago, back in the late 70s, when integration was just starting, I tried to integrate a young Down syndrome girl into her kindergarten. We persuaded the kindy to take her, and the mother was keen. But the other mothers in the in the Down syndrome group started warning everybody, oh, careful, it's not good for her. They went to the school and told the kindy teacher, don't take her, you'll ruin the child's life. Well, the mothers persevered, the child stayed in the kindy, the child went to school, the child went to high school. Because of that mother, she got an individualized program. And when the school became smaller and lost the special ed teacher, education department told the mother, well, you can move to the next suburb. And the mother said, no, this is her school and she has to have a teacher here. That's your policy. So she took them to court and she won. Maybe that gives you an idea of how hard some of the early fights for integration and inclusion were. Okay, next slide. But improvements have to be praised. Every education department now has a resource centre and specialists visiting teachers to assist with special disabilities. So if you have a child who is hearing impaired or visually impaired, they are integrated. There's no question about that. The question is, how many hours of this extra support will they need? How much help will his teacher need? When I first started, we had schools for the hearing impaired and schools for the visually impaired. They have been closed. These kids are integrated. And hopefully so will be the schools for autism. Children are allocated aid time. If you're in a local school, you have a disability, you have a right to have an aid. But how many hours you get depends on how many aids are available. And the cash is often a little short. So that's not enough. And sometimes the aides are not well trained. Children now have IEPs. And again, the quality varies. It's still early days for IEPs. But the NDIS complements the education the child gets at school. And that has been the big strength in helping with the IEPs improve. You've got families getting psychological support, speech therapy support, OT support, physiotherapy support. Did I mention language therapists? That they're very important. All these supports, and if necessary, even social worker support to help the family make decisions. NDIS can make these available to the family to guide them, to guide the child through those objectives. Now the school becomes part of the group, and a good school knows how to use it and how to become part of that system, and their IEPs are stronger. Next. Well, where there is improvement, there's also negatives. There's the other side. Many schools just provide a setting for the aide to teach the child. And you walk into the school and you say, oops, why is the aide sitting with the child in the corner there? And that's not necessarily some poor little country school. That can be an expensive private school. The aide is insulating the child from the school, from the children, from the peers. Many children in the units graduate to special schools and don't get new skills. And we have built many more special schools than used to be when you look at the relationship to population growth. We've built many more. Parents sometimes choose special schools and sometimes are actually directed to choose them. And it's a worry because Australia has a lot of migrants and a lot of people not speaking English. And sometimes the children that are directed into special schools actually are not speaking English or are traumatized by some of the previous experiences that have got them there. So we have to be careful in making those decisions. Next, we will look at the barriers. What holds us back? What do we do? What must we do to push those barriers aside? Social attitudes are slow to change. You probably know that well. Of all countries, The people escaping the Russian bloc are the ones that had to suddenly become westernized overnight. The change was sudden and difficult for many to take. Attitudes don't change easily. So you've got families with inappropriate attitudes to their child with disability, with no hope. You've got school settings that are not appropriate and teachers who've been taught to teach in a different way. And I'm interested in Jurga's numbers, that the teachers often are elderly, and they are the ones that have needed the help. A lot of preparatory work is needed to change, to make those change real. And I sort of think of, we have advertising to change things. We have advertising and it works well, or else we wouldn't have it. People wouldn't pay for it. In Australia, the very strong push against smoking, for example, and advertising reduced the smoking rates. You need large moves in society to change attitudes, to realize that some of these kids can achieve so much and be good, useful citizens. And then there's the parents, uninformed and too protective. Parents are told what they're told, and often they're told something like, your child won't be anything. He won't get far. He won't cope with school. She'll never do anything. She won't talk. Well, we know what ABA can do. We don't say those things anymore, but it's still said. And also, many parents seek the safer environment. They look at a special school. As I said, in Australia, they're all new. Nice and shiny and bright colours. Small numbers of kids, large numbers of teachers. Oh, my child will be happy here. My child will be safe here. It's well fenced. He won't run out on the street. We need to teach him to not run out on the street unless we intend to keep him locked up forever. So yes, they choose the schools for the wrong reasons. We need to inform parents at the start when a diagnosis is given. We need to inform them and explain what can be achieved. We don't promise them that their kid will make it, but we do say that there is a wide range of possibilities. So don't judge him now. Judge him after we have worked with him. Next slide. Barriers need to change. I think it's the one. Yes, it is. Poorly informed school administration. You have no idea how many times we actually have, when we go in to talk about a kid and his needs, we have to tell the school principal that you need to apply for a teacher aide before this date, because if you don't, you won't get one for another 6 months. So they work for the education department. I don't, but I have to tell them how their education department works. Unable to organize the support process, not even aware of it sometimes. The support process, which includes a complete surrounding of the child with the people that are helping him, the family, the NDIS therapist team, the school team, all working towards the same objectives. And above all, they're unaware of the benefits for the children. Yes, the status quo is always hard to change. You know, It's easier to push something that's already rolling than to actually start it rolling. Try pushing a car that is stalled. Too many people are comfortable working where they are in the old system. Too many people have got it all worked out. This is my regime. This is my sequence of behaviors. This is my schedule. If we have to change it, they're not comfortable. What will I do? I might fail. What else will they ask of me? So yes, even when we're not autistic, we don't like change that much. We have to invest in helping this change to happen. We have to invest in changing their views. And what this project has been doing is just that. And that's why I think it is so important. It is achieving, bit by bit, area by area, child by child sometimes, family by family, the changes that are needed. Next. More barriers still. Money. Skills. How do you get skills? You need money for skills. Teachers cannot cope with the programming needs without support. It is only recently that we have actually given teachers time for programming. It's called dot time. I think it needs to be bigger than a dot. Teachers need time to cope. Time has to be paid for. While the teachers are having their dot time, who's going to look after the class? Teachers need skills. The education of teachers has to change. Universities are still doing what they've always done, teaching what they're good at, teaching subjects, rather than teaching methodology. They're not looking at children, they're still looking at classrooms. There needs to be a lot of change there. It is coming, but not as fast as it's needed. Assistants need training. An untrained assistant cannot manage behavior. Assistants needs ABA training to know how to manage. There is still an attitude that a child has to be punished. No, we don't punish dogs anymore. So please stop punishing children. A child has to be taught. And the child has to learn with reinforcement, with desire to learn being created, with the learning being worthwhile to that child at that point. Not because he should understand that it'll be useful for him when he's an adult. So all of that means training, training, training. And if you have training, you also need oversight, you need supervision, and you need someone who can give good advice when the too hard positions turn up. Education takes on a new meaning if we look beyond academic skills. These skills need to be addressed. Social skills, functional skills, community skills. These are the skills our children will need when they move into the community. And while they're in school, if they're not taught those skills, we have difficulties. In fact, we have a problem where many of the integrated kids are doing well enough in the school setting, But then we realize that they're not getting the social work skills they need that special schools teach. And I have taken children and put them back into a special school at the senior level to teach them to cope in a work setting. Because special schools, among other things they do well, also do things like work experience. Many schools now are also beginning to give work experience and are moving forward, but it's taken them some time to realize that work experience is needed for their children and not just education that takes you to university. And then look at the resources and funding. There's never any money. And the money is grabbed by everybody at once. No money for support people, for special materials, time for meetings, time for coordination. Policy changes precede financial enabling. That seems to be an organizational thing, but it always happens. We make decisions and then we turn around to say, oh, how can we make those decisions work? What are the possibilities? Next slide. More barriers. It gets worse. Autism has just about upended the whole school system. The high numbers flooding in and demanding at least integration, if not inclusion, have flooded the schools. Unexpected and unpredicted and unplanned for. Of course, we end up with negative attitudes as people begin to crumble. Like my example of way back in the 70s, when we had to go to this country town and calm those teachers down and tell them they were doing a good job, which they were doing. They were doing what was needed, but they were stressing. People are stressing everywhere. And I guess I should add another recent stressor, and that was COVID. Special education through Zoom doesn't work all that well, especially if parents are not at home. So yes, the mountains to overcome are not small. And as these children get older, they become more difficult. We can blame adolescents. All adolescents are becoming more difficult, as every parent will know. But adolescents with ASD can be extremely difficult because the stress levels go up incredibly fast to unbearable stress. And there is also, the stress tends to be worse for those that are higher functioning. Those without language or with minimal language tend to be more susceptible to epilepsy. And epilepsy can turn up at adolescence. So we suddenly have medical issues and psychiatric issues on top of education. Next slide, please. Okay, let's go through the age groups, because it's not always as bad as adolescence. And you can see how you can build up if you put in the efforts at the early ages when the kids are easy or relatively easy. At kindy, the barriers are easy. Little children are loving, flexible, inclusive, tolerant. It's only when they get older that they learn intolerance, unfortunately. And most little children accept our children happily. So it is easy to start inclusion in a kindergarten. The child becomes part of the group. The NDIS also focuses a lot on younger children with more money for them. And they get all the support. They get the inclusion. Everybody's happy. And this age group is to a highest degree successful. Next slide, please. And then we have middle primary, end of primary. When differences begin to appear, first, many of the children now are not coping quite as well. Their language levels are not as strong, and the other children now notice that. Friendship in the early stages is based on play. And while they can play together, everyone's happy. And it is inclusive. But as the kids get older, they begin to talk. They have long conversations, discussions. Our children begin to miss out because their language levels are not as strong. They sit around and listen. Many groups still remain tolerant and they support our special needs kid because they're growing up together and they've always been there. So it's okay. So it's not that hard to keep that child coping to the end of primary school. But then comes high school. Can we, next slide? Early high school coincides with early adolescence. And early adolescence is not a nice time with most kids. Adjustment to new school, new peer group. Stress behaviors go up. There is no one single teacher to turn to. Teachers walk in and walk out. And as one teacher told me when I went into a school to ask for help for a child, that was in Victoria actually, he said, I teach history. I see him for 2 hours a week, and that's it. I know nothing about him, and I'm not going to waste my time. Oh. Getting integration with that sort of attitude is very difficult. I guess you have to look for teachers who see them more than 2 hours a week or 1 hour a week. You have to look for teachers who are more willing. You have to also bring in this special ed people. Without them, these kids don't cope. And the peers are not nice at that stage. Peers are busy establishing their own identity and status. They're forming groups. No one wants a special ed child in their group because I'm not like him. No. They all look to see now who's going to be the alpha and who's going to be the alpha's best friend. The adjutant. The social politics of those young adolescents are quite complex, not unlike politics in general. And they lead to rejection, they lead to bullying, they even lead to physical hurt. Next one, next slide, please. If you survive that period, and many don't, you get to senior high school, which is better in some ways and worse in others. Academic pressure keeping up with assignments and examinations now. For children who are so scared to fail is difficult. Stress levels rise. Social issues, the dreaded opposite sex issues. Emotional complexity, self-awareness, who am I, what am I, sexuality, what do I do with it? Imminent change to adulthood. I've got to think about the future, career decisions. I can't cope with today. How can I cope with next year and the year after? Medical issues like depression and anxiety abound. Most of them now need some medical chemical help to get that anxiety level down somewhat. On the other hand, there's one little shine of positiveness, and that is that peer groups are now more mature, more inclusive, and more understanding. And often they value the skills that our children have. Next slide. Well, I want to look at the schools and their role now, given that we understand how the children progress and change. What is a good school? What does a school have to do? A good school will have a bullying policy, anti-bullying policy. And I tell the parents, when you're looking for a school, always ask the first question, and the only one you need to ask sometimes, what is your bullying policy? If they say, we don't have bullying in this school, I know they have no policy, and I say, go elsewhere. If they say, yes, we're using this, we do that, say, okay, let's compare it with the next school and see which one's better. Communication and coordination meetings are essential. I recently went to a coordination meeting at a high school for a young boy. We had the special ed teacher, we had the middle school principal there, and we came, two of us from ISADD, psychologist and case manager. Communication's essential. The special adolescent needs individual counseling, needs individual support from the school and also from the home. But let's look at the school. The school needs to be able to jump to help him out when that child has a problem. They need to provide space for him to withdraw. They need to provide support. To the younger kid, to the older kid, they need to provide counseling, etc. And there needs to be flexibility to cope. Rules may need to be built for a special child. Things might need to be made easier. Sometimes part-time, sometimes extra tuition organized, sometimes less homework. There needs to be flexibility. And students have to have individual IEPs that are relevant to their needs. Well, what do we get in a bad school? Next slide. If a school is not prepared for inclusion, you will have difficulties. The special student begins to deteriorate. And we know, we work with these kids as individuals, we send them to school, and they go down in their functioning. Deteriorates academically, deteriorates behaviorally, so it's difficult to manage. there'll be some level of bullying. And so the child begins to collect a heap of new diagnoses. Anxiety disorder. Oh, this child has anxiety disorder. It is bigger than his autism. It is his primary problem. OCD, obsession compulsive disorder, which is what they do when they're stressed. ADD, the dreaming child. I'm so stressed, I just pretend I'm somewhere else and it's not happening. Yes, the dreamer, he's not attending. ADD, let's give him some medication. ODD, oppositional defiance disorder, for the child who says, I'm going to fight for my rights. I'm going to fight back when I'm abused. And eventually PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And when you talk to an 18-year-old or a 16-year-old who's telling you about the nightmares he has about his kindergarten experiences and being bullied in the kindergarten all those years ago, you realize what PTSD is. And if he can't sleep, he can't learn. For many, the stress levels can lead to beyond these new diagnoses, to diagnoses such as psychotic breakdowns, to self-abuse, to withdrawal. How many kids have chosen to come home from school and sit in a wardrobe just to relax? How many kids begin to cut themselves, especially girls? They cut themselves. You say, why do you do it? It helps me forget. And another one said, maybe someone will help me. They take a pencil and then drive it into themselves to feel the pain. That pain is better than what they're feeling inside. Your heart goes out to them. Psychotic breakdowns where they begin to see things and tell you things that don't exist. And then many begin to say, oh, that's a start of schizophrenia. And they get the wrong medication when we know that if we could reduce the stress, there'd be no schizophrenia symptoms. And probably worse of all, catatonia. More and more, I'm finding that the literature is talking about the link between catatonia and autism, that the high stress of autism drives young autistic people to catatonia. Catatonia used to be something that the worst of schizophrenia got, and it is basically a paralysis when you cannot do anything. With our children, it starts with not being able to go across from one thing to another, not being able to transition, being stuck in a doorway, walking backwards and forwards because they eventually go through. With the slowing down, with repetitiveness in those slower movements, and then the freezer. As one young man told us, I just freeze and I cannot move. And he can freeze in strange positions. Just freeze. And this happened with one client who had got as far as second year university with support. When the support disappeared, because the man went away, the teacher went away, he was left alone. He failed second year. Parents pushed him to a lower level course, which the weight was. He failed again, and he shouldn't have. He had the ability, but he failed. He didn't cope with the exams. That pushed him into catatonia. After electric shock, this young man was in nappies and diapers. It took us so much more to begin to at least talk to him about it, understand where he was. But it was too slow for people. He got more shocks. We don't work with that anymore, sadly. Okay, there's no education for them. Next, please. So we looked at the school. What about the extra school assistance that these kids need? People with ASD have difficulties in reciprocal social communication and in flexible interest behaviors, sensory tolerance. They just don't fit. And that brings the stress levels higher and higher. And with the higher stress levels, they don't become independent. They stay dependent. So what do we do? Next, please. We give them ABA. For most of these children, inclusive school is not enough. They will not make it without this level of preparation. EIBI, we now call it, Early Intensive Behavioral Intervention. Early because we start with a toddler. Intensive, 20 hours, maybe 10 if your parents are joining in too. Behavior means ABA, Applied Behavior Analysis, what Jurga was talking about. Without that, we don't break through that original autism. And that usually means either a lot of money from the NDIS or a lot of money from parents in other countries. Next slide, please. When the child grows up, and needs to navigate the social system and the environment on their own, a version of behavioral therapy is cognitive behavior therapy. And they need that cognitive behavior therapy support to talk through the problems they've had, to work out new solutions. We say, okay, that was a problem you faced. You did this. What else could you have done? Let's talk about it. Let's practice some of these options so that you feel brave enough to do it next time. And maybe next time you will. That also takes time. So the older child, the high school child, needs that CBT support and needs that support on and off, and needs to know that he has to come for it when he needs it. Ask for it. Next, please. I want to finish off with some good news. That even with the worst schooling, very rigid, old-fashioned schools in Indonesia, we have had 2 absolutely brilliant successes. And there's many more, but these 2 really stand out. One was a girl where the family did ABA and the parents took it on. They realized she had ability in art. They gave her art classes. Today, she runs her own little business of silk screen printing and silk scarves. And by the way, she's the most brilliant, energetic, loving young lady who gave me a big hug when I met her after all those years. She was a scared little girl once. And the other one has written a book. She went to a very rigid school. The parents insisted on that school. It had to be in English. So she had to cope with 2 languages. Both had to be taught. We taught her both. At 15, I met her and she chatted about Lenin's effects on the policies of Indonesia in the 1940s. I thought, oh my God, she knows her history. And then she wrote this book, which got published as a children's book. It's about two girls who were called, who had been labeled as vampires at their school, and how they had to fight to prove that they were okay, that they were not vampires, how they were treated, and how another girl helped them. And I thought she wrote her own little story in that, but it was published publicly. Yes, we have successes. Next. More schools with basic successes, as you can see here. Two brothers, one IT, one in law. One young lady, married, has a job. I'm looking at those young kids we started with. One young man who was very dyspraxic and very hard to understand his speech is now an architect. And in Lithuania, we're slowly getting there too. We have a few. We're getting there with our adolescents and the hard work that ISADD is putting in. So, summing up the Australian, next slide, please. Experience. Inclusion for children with disability, especially autism, is now accepted. Parents choose. Most schools are doing the right thing, providing inclusion. Support is available. Segregated special schools, still there and still working. And maybe we need to improve them next. It's taken a long time to get this far, so don't expect that much of yourself. And the final slide, to say thank you for listening and continue. May the spirit of this project inspire you all to continue to work with young students, whatever their abilities, and bring them into the Lithuanian community. It is a benefit both to the students, but also to the total nation. Thank you. I've gone a few minutes over. Sorry. Any questions?
Yeah, thank you very much for your brilliant presentation and such a broad and vast picture of Australian school system. And if we have questions, so from public or from the Zoom chatter, any questions? So then I would just ask one question. What steps you see for Lithuania to start in successful inclusion? Few sentences, if you may.
You're on the right track, but the kickstart we got that improved us so much was the NDIS. Begin to look at disability as something that needs help wherever it is, whatever it is. And maybe get that medical model of let's fix it into the education system. Because the NDIS, with all its problems and all its disasters, has actually made a very big improvement to the education system by providing all those outside specialists, the extra reports, the extra information, the extra ideas for all those kids. That's my answer.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for supporting us throughout all the project with supervision, great advices, examples, and constant being in touch with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you indeed for having me. And keep on working.
Thank you. Ir
You,
jeigu daugiau neturim klausimų, tai atsisveikinam su Jūra ir paliekam ją grįžti į karštį Australijai, o patys einam į kavos pertraukėlę. Ačiū ir iki pasimatymo.